I want you to hit me as hard as you can.
This time on Movie Endings Explained, we're going to be looking at something a little bit different. I've often found that covering films in this series that don't have some big twist ending to be even more interesting than those that do. And the film that we're covering this go around certainly has a lot of interesting working parts. To completely unpack the entire film would take a whole series itself, but to focus in on the final act of this staggering epic has a certain appeal.
Let's go get this son of a bitch.
Avengers Endgame, the quote-unquote biggest movie of all time, exploded onto screens a year ago, becoming a gargantuan success and thrilling the world. Goosebumps were rippled across the entire globe as Captain America proved himself worthy.
I knew it.
Tears rolled as Tony Stark completed his journey from a selfish, egotistical prick to the man who selflessly sacrificed his life to save the universe. And uproarious laughs echoed through the cinemas as Korg informed Thor that that kid on the TV was calling him a dickhead again. Okay, maybe that one was just me.
Hey guys!
And that's even without mentioning the portals, Ant-Man delivering the most massive punch ever, Captain Marvel no-selling a blow from Thanos, Captain America admiring his own ass, Thor realizing he was still worthy not long after making sure he went for the head, Black Widow's moving sacrifice, and the snap heard around the world. Okay, I'm getting carried away. I love this film, but to discuss the ending, I'll try to take a bit more of an impartial look. I'm going to assume that in watching this video you have seen Avengers Endgame. As such, I'm not going to recap the entirety of the film's dense 3-hour story. After the shattering events of Infinity War, 5 years to be precise, our remaining heroes travel back in time through the quantum realm, assemble the Infinity Stones, and bring back everyone who was lost in 2018. Meanwhile, Thanos from a now alternate 2014 has traveled forward in time to 2023 to face off against the Avengers, to take back the Infinity Stones he hadn't even collected yet. Yeah, we'll get to that. And after an incredible battle, Tony uses the Infinity Stones to destroy Thanos and his army. He dies, and our heroes mourn the passing of the man that started it all, at least from our perspective, dating back to the film that kicked off the Marvel Cinematic Universe, Iron Man. But the Infinity Stones were taken from points in the past, which has now created new branch realities where the stones do not exist, some of which will cause terrible new realities. So in order to restore the balance in the times in which the Avengers took the stones, they all need to be replaced at the moment they were originally stolen. Steve Rogers opts to return all of the stones himself at the end of the movie. This is the part we're going to focus on the most here.
Don't worry, Bruce. Clip all the branches.
That clip all the branches comment is a very clever line, as for me at least it ties up any notion of this journey going wrong. The film is over. This isn't the start of a new adventure, though it certainly would have made for an interesting story. It also very literally speaks to the idea of the clipping of the branch realities of which the Ancient One spoke of when she explained to Bruce Banner how the timelines would be affected if the stones were taken. Seconds later, Bucky and Sam spot an old Steve Rogers sat on a bench nearby. It turns out after he replaced all of the stones, he took a detour and has now lived a life. A beautiful one. He passes on the Captain America mantle and the shield to Sam. While Steve's Infinity journey would make for an interesting story, it probably wouldn't play out the best in a realized film. Here's what he would have had to take back to restore the branched realities that the time heist created. He'd need to go back to 2012 New York and return the scepter which held the Mind Stone, the one he himself took and then fought himself over.
Oh, you gotta be shitting me.
And you would assume that 2023 Steve Rogers would avoid this particular confrontation and not get into a triple threat match with himself. Then there's the Time Stone, which he would need to simply return to the Ancient One. The Tesseract, however, is an altogether more interesting and entirely more difficult problem to solve. They initially failed to secure the Tesseract in 2012, with Loki stealing it and disappearing. So Steve and Tony went to the S.H.I.E.L.D. headquarters in 1970 to take it from an earlier time. So 2023 Steve would need to return it there from the point in which it was stolen. But what about the 2012 Tesseract that Loki stole, which has now created yet another branch reality? Well, my initial thought was that Steve had fixed that too, sticking around in 2012 New York long enough to covertly thwart this theft and keeping the timeline neat and secure, as he said, clipping all the branches. That leaves more open to interpretation than, say, I'll clip those 5 very specific branches. However, the upcoming Disney Plus series Loki is said to follow the character from the point in which he stole the Tesseract, wreaking havoc across history. How that will affect the larger Marvel timeline remains to be seen, but it does seem to confirm that Steve didn't exactly clip all the branches. How much this moment in Endgame will be covered in the Loki series, and how much that series will impact the MCU moving forward, if at all, once again remains to be seen. To return the Reality Stone, Steve would have to go back to 2013 Asgard, and, well, put the ether back inside Jane Foster. We'll just let that sit there for a second. And we'll move swiftly on. Maybe this is why it wouldn't have worked too well on screen, but hey, I'm sure there's a creative and totally non-offensive way in which that scenario could play out. Before leaving Asgard though, Steve would need to return Thor's hammer. We can see that he takes it with him, along with the cool briefcase containing all the stones, in 2023. To leave Thor without his trusty hammer would surely impact many of the events that followed Thor: The Dark World. Then Steve would need to return the orb that contains the Power Stone to Morag, and at this point I should say that there's no specific order in which he needs to do these things, but I figured I would save the most interesting one for last. Finally, the Soul Stone would need to be returned to Vormir. This is one moment that could probably be a very cool cinematic moment, as I'm sure the reunion of Steve Rogers and Red Skull, the hellish keeper of the stone, would be a very intriguing one. There is the question of whether or not Natasha would be able to be brought back, but the rules set up imply that a sacrifice made on Vormir is irreversible. Hulk even tells Steve that when he snapped everyone back in 2023, he tried to include Black Widow, but was unsuccessful. There's no going back from Vormir. With the stones returned, reality as we know it would be pretty much back to normal, but with a few exceptions. Firstly, when 2023 Nebula kills herself, which itself seemingly creates a grandfather paradox. I mean, taking the fact that time travel does not exist, and if you really think about it, if it ever did, it's already happened and someone would have come back. Anyway, the rules of time travel have been set up to be very different in this film from what we already know, which is very keenly observed in the film itself to be taken from a litany of popular movies that employ time travel as a plot device. All of that aside though, the grandfather paradox, an idea that if a version of you was killed in the past, you would then cease to exist, something that Back to the Future aligns very closely with, is not applicable to Nebula's self-murder. The 2014 Nebula, not yet brave enough to turn against the tyranny of her cruel father Thanos, cannot be swayed by her sister Gamora and the 2023 version of herself, and is shot. But the 2014 Nebula is now from a different branch reality, where she left 2014 to travel to 2023. The same can be said of the Thanos our heroes fight at the end of the film. He is from 2014, a Thanos hungry for the stones who has not yet achieved his goal. The Thanos we knew died in 2018 when Thor decapitated him. That remains the same. When 2014 Thanos dies at the end of Endgame, along with the demise of 2014 Nebula, a new branch reality now exists from 2014/Guardians of the Galaxy onwards, in which Nebula and Thanos no longer live inside. That casualty of the time travel twisting can no longer be undone. The other is the new timeline we see at the very end of the film. Steve Rogers, after successfully restoring most of the affected timelines, takes himself back to 1948 to reunite with the love of his life, Peggy Carter. They presumably live out a long and happy life together before her death in 2016 and get married, as can be seen on Cap's ring finger in 2023. But did the old Cap we see in 2023 live alongside the same timeline we've all experienced in the movies over the past decade? The logic set up in the film would dictate that no, he didn't. 2023 Steve going back to 1948 to be with Peggy now creates a new reality in which there are two Steve Rogers, one frozen in ice for the most part. Living a simple life with Peggy, and likely a more private, secretive one, wouldn't really affect this new timeline at all. And finally, he would return to the moment he left in 2023 to see Bucky and Sam, and to pass on his shield, which was broken in Endgame, right? Which lends more weight to the idea that old Cap is indeed from a now new, if barely different, timeline. But then, he seemingly has taken the shield from the main timeline Captain America at some point, which creates a problem. Now one of the writers of the film, Christopher Marcus, has commented on this paradox and actually refutes this idea. He says, "We are not experts on time travel, but the Ancient One specifically states that when you take an Infinity Stone out of a timeline, it creates a new timeline. So Steve going back and just being there would not create a new timeline. So I reject the Steve is in an alternate reality theory. I do believe there is simply a period in world history from 48 to now where there are two Steve Rogers. And anyway, for a large chunk of that, one of them is frozen in ice, so it's not like they'd be running into each other." This is a very intriguing stance, and I don't know if Marcus is specifically stating that only when an Infinity Stone is taken out of a timeline does a new branch reality get created. The rules are definitely blurred with this, as the events of every film post-Guardians of the Galaxy for the most part would be completely altered right up to Endgame with the removal of Nebula and, more importantly, Thanos from the timeline. So clearly the branch reality theory does apply to characters being removed from them and not just Infinity Stones exclusively. However, Steve going back to the 40s and living a quiet life with Peggy wouldn't adversely affect things, and this is the writer of the movie we're talking about. So the answer here is, old Cap is from the same timeline, which to be honest, sits a little bit better with me, as the idea of old Cap travelling through time seems a little goofy. I mean, he seems like the kind of guy who would fall over if you sneeze in his direction, even if he is Captain America. But this also raises a question that may be a convenient retcon, or possibly planned all along, though I think that's really unlikely. Was Peggy Carter's husband always Steve Rogers? In Winter Soldier, we see Steve visit an elderly Peggy on her deathbed. Her mind is fading, and it's known that she has a family, a husband and 2 children. If the husband was not Steve Rogers, then he undoubtedly did create a new branch reality in 1948. I mean, she wouldn't go on to meet her husband and have her children, things have been changed. But if the husband is Steve Rogers, then he didn't create a new timeline. The other writer of Avengers Endgame, Stephen McFeely, also commented on this, saying, "Here's how we reconcile it. We think there have always been 2 Caps from 1945 to say now, and we just didn't know that. That's the loop, right? You can't alter your future by going back to the past. So his younger self is on ice somewhere, and it's only in 2011 that there are technically 2 Steves running around, to the point where if you were to look closely at Peggy's funeral, there'd be an old man in the back named Roger Stevens." When he was asked if this means that we can really see an old Steve Rogers at the funeral in the movie, he clarified adamantly no, which to me soundly confirms this wasn't planned around the time of Civil War, but has been retconned into the timeline. The futures of all our heroes moving forward remain fuzzy, but mostly clear. Iron Man is rumoured to have a cameo in Black Widow, which I don't personally think is necessary, even if it would be fine in the sense that the film is a prequel. The way Tony was handled in Spider-Man Far From Home was perfect. He doesn't appear, but his impact post-Endgame is felt very strongly. As it should. I kind of like the idea that Robert Downey Jr.'s last performance as Iron Man was this iconic moment, which was the last scene filmed for the movie. Black Widow will of course get her own movie, the next in line to be released. Spider-Man has already hit the big screens again in Far From Home. Black Panther 2 is in the works. Guardians of the Galaxy 3 is coming, which will no doubt have to address the fact that Gamora is now from 2014, with none of the experiences we saw her go through in the first 2 Guardians movies and Infinity War. Then there's Thor, Love and Thunder, Doctor Strange in the Multiverse of Madness, not to mention the Loki series, which will touch on events from Endgame, Falcon and the Winter Soldier, which will surely follow Sam's journey to picking up the mantle of Captain America, and WandaVision, which seems to be existing in its own reality from everything else we've seen. and that intrigues me more than anything else. The future of Mark Ruffalo's Hulk and Jeremy Renner's Hawkeye seems to be up in the air at the moment, but anything can happen. And could Steve Rogers appear again in the Marvel Cinematic Universe? I think it's possible and could definitely work, but I think that Avengers Endgame operates best as an operatic, epic conclusion to a 22-movie arc, one that should have never worked, and ultimately achieves that operatic status through the tragic yet hopeful conclusions of Steve Rogers and Tony Stark's stories. The two have butted heads since the beginning, but both proved to be at their best when working together. Tony went out on his shield in the only outcome that was possible to work in defeating Thanos. The most selfish person we know in the Marvel Cinematic Universe does the most selfless thing possible. And Steve, the soldier that he always wanted to be, went home after the war, and unlike most soldiers, he got to live out a whole other life, and one of peace. And when we see Peggy's house at the very end, the front door is just slightly open. It's implied that he's only just turned up, that they have embraced, and before anything else, finally had their dance. There is no post-credit scene in Endgame, but you can hear something just as the credits stop rolling. The unmistakable clanging of metal on metal. Theories sprouted over this, but there is really only one answer. It's Tony Stark, building his first Iron Man suit. A tip of the hat to the man and the moment that started it all.